Yeah, with him and with really anyone that I've already researched, these are like world-class founders, right? Their companies
Yeah.
are typically requirement to be at least $1 billion plus company. There is undoubtedly survivorship bias with every single one of these people,
Yeah.
right? Like you could say that, like, yeah, they made it, and like these are lessons from them, but like how many people, to your point, had the same things and did not make it? So I do think about that every time, but I still think it's helpful to hear the stories of how they went about it and everything like that.
Welcome to the Rideshare Guy podcast, where you will learn about the rideshare and mobility industry straight from Harry Campbell, who's got over 5 years experience covering the industry and has talked to thousands of drivers. There's no better place to stay up to date, entertained, and educated. So let's dive in.
So Justin Gordan is the founder of Just Go Grind, a podcast community and newsletter with more than 18,000 subscribers featuring weekly deep dives on world-class founders. He previously spent 2.5 years as the director of marketing and community at VITALIZE Venture Capital, where he remains a venture partner and member of their angel investing community, VITALIZE Angels. Justin, how are you doing today?
I'm good, Harry. Thanks for having me on.
Yeah, I feel like I owe you one since you had me on your podcast a long time ago, now that I think about it. But I will say, I'm not having you on because of that. I'm having you on because of a recent newsletter you did on a guy my audience probably knows pretty well, Travis Kalanick, right?
Yes, TK, as they call him. There's so much to this story, so I'm happy to chat about today.
Awesome. Cool. Well, before we get into the story of TK and how he got that nickname, I don't know if you uncovered that in your research, but hopefully you did. Tell me a little bit more about your community and sort of these deep dives that you do on founders, because I think it's pretty cool. I've listened to a couple of your interviews on your podcast before, and now you've got this newsletter that you're doing full time, and it really seems like you're doing these really interesting deep dives on, I guess, mainly famous founders. Is that how you describe it?
Yeah, I would say I call them like just world-class founders, which can mean a lot of
Cool.
different things. And I try to keep it to a variety of industries. I think that's more interesting. Every single day we touch different products, we use different
Hmm.
products. And I find it most fascinating to be like, who is the person behind that? Who's the team behind that? How did this come to be? And that to me is like the most exciting part of it. So even starting this newsletter, it started with Sam Altman originally. I heard about him on the My First Million podcast, and they were like, he was their Billy of the week. And I'm like,
Yeah.
I know of Sam Altman, but I don't really know much more about him other than like OpenAI or something. And then once you dive deeper into the story, it's just fascinating. And so that got me started. And then since then, it's covered everything from him to Melanie Perkins to Tope Awatana of Calendly. You have software companies, you have like actual CPG companies, you have someone like Sarah Blakely with Spanx, just all over the full spectrum. And I also actually alternate between men and women every time. A lot of times
Oh,
there's like
cool.
undertold stories of women who are like phenomenal entrepreneurs, but whenever you have a show, it's always like men, or any newsletter,
Yeah.
it's like men. So I always try to like switch it up a little bit. And so it just kept going from there, and quit my job 2 months ago, and here we are.
Nice. Well, I'm always a fan of people quitting their jobs. So I know you and I have exchanged a little entrepreneurial advice, but I'm sure we'll get more into that in the future over a beer or two. I also see that you did a profile on Tony Xu, who I just interviewed. So I think that might be another cool one. So you've got quite a number of diverse industries, folks that you're covering in your newsletter, but definitely a few deep dives on people that I know my audience from rideshare and mobility and gig economy will definitely care about.
Yeah, I know you interviewed him. I actually listened to that one, and he's phenomenal in many ways. I know, again, it's one of those like controversial things of people loving, hating Uber, loving, hating DoorDash, like all these
Yeah.
different companies. But I always have a lot of empathy for the founders, knowing just how hard it is to start these companies. And
Yeah.
so that to me is just always fascinating about listening their stories and everything. And so I love what you've done as well to kind of help people out from that perspective.
Very cool. Well, I mean, speaking of hated founders, no, I'm just kidding. But obviously, the drivers in my audience, I think Tony Xu has, I would say he might have a better, definitely, obviously, if you look at the comments on my YouTube video, my recent interview with Tony, I'm sure plenty of people say, Harry, oh, you're a sellout, or oh, why didn't you ask him this, or why didn't you ask him that? But I do feel like Travis Kalanick's relationship with drivers was a lot more tenuous or aggressive, you might say. So I am curious. But I think at the same time, whether you love or hate a lot of these founders, like you said, it's really interesting to kind of understand where they came from. There's certain things that I think are more quantitative, like TK, whether you love him or hate him, he's built an amazing company in Uber and the business and the fact that you can call a ride. So I think that's why it's cool that you're exploring these founders. And I'm excited to dig into TK with you today. How does that sound?
Yeah, I'm excited. There's lots to talk about. We can go a variety of ways, so we'll see where you take it.
Well, I think the most important thing that I kind of joked with you, I think it was off air, but how did this guy get his nickname TK? If you work in tech, do you just have to have a nickname or?
I don't know. I mean, it's always this whole thing around like only his close friends can call him TK. That's like they showed in like in the show and everything. I never found much about that, but I actually do know
Got it.
people who have worked there at Uber and they also call him TK. So like anyone who's like in the cult of Uber per se definitely calls him TK, and that's a whole thing. And like the whole kind of drama on the show around like you can't call me that to like someone else like wasn't in the
Yeah.
circle is just hilarious to me. But never really actually saw how he got that name, which is maybe it's a
Yeah,
secret somewhere.
if I had to guess, I feel like it's a sort of thing. If you work in tech, especially at like an early stage company, everyone gets a nickname and you just kind of call it that. So if Travis is listening, maybe you can shoot me an email later and let me know what the real story
Clear
is.
things up.
But yeah, but so I mean, I think his story is pretty, the general arc is pretty well known about him starting Uber, or not starting Uber, but kind of coming on as a co-founder. What in your kind of research and all the work that you did? I mean, I don't know how long this blog post you wrote was. I don't know, maybe 10 or 15,000 words, but what don't people know about TK?
A lot of it is the struggle before he co-founded Uber with Garrett Camp. Like a lot of that is unknown by people. We see a little bit of it in the show Super Pumped. If you've seen it, if you read the book, there's more of it there. But when I did my research, a lot of this and a lot of the most interesting parts of these deep dives I do in founders is like the early days. And so you look at like TK, it's someone who at 6 years old learned to code. He's kind of been nerdy from the very beginning, very into like math. And so like early on, he actually got picked on a lot as a kid, even as a young kid, and eventually kind of basically fought back against the bullies to then not be picked on. And so that's something that people don't realize. And then even from a young age, you could see the ambition, the drive. He sold like $20,000 worth of Cutco knives in the summer, one summer. Like the type of person that's just like tenacious as he is, you can see where that's the foundation of what would later be Uber. Yeah. So you can kind of see the early days. People don't all understand that though.
Yeah, I think there's this famous story of him playing Nintendo Wii too, right? About how he was ultra competitive at that. And so one thing this made me think of when I was reading about his early days in your newsletter is that how many people do you think kind of have that profile like Travis, but never make it big? Like it's sort of easy to look back and be like, wow, he was 6 years old learning to code. He was picked on. So he had that chip on his shoulder and he was selling Cutco knives and went to UCLA. And it like kind of makes sense when you start thinking about, oh, this is the guy who grew Uber and founded Uber. But do you think that like he was like there were like 100 people that had that kind of background and he was one of 100? Or what do you think about like the sort of overall profile with people like that, with that type of background?
Yeah, with him and with really anyone that I've already researched, these are like world-class founders, right? Their companies are typically requirement to be at least $1 billion plus company. There is undoubtedly survivorship bias with every single one of these people, right? Like you could say that like, yeah, they made it, and like these are lessons from them, but like how many people, to your point, had the same things and did not make it? So I do think about that every time, but I still think it's helpful to hear the stories of how they went about it and everything like that. With Travis in particular, though, like I don't know if there's many people that are his level of tenacious, determined, etc. And obviously there are people like him who did not make it. I think that anyone like him though has probably made a successful company at some point if you look at their whole career. I don't think you can have his tenacious like mentality, this win at all cost mentality, and not at least have a win somewhere in your career. So I find it hard to believe that anyone with his skill set, with his determination, wouldn't succeed eventually. There's just like a whole maxim around like how often companies fail and startups fail like 90% of the time. And yeah, they may fail 90% of the time, but founders do not fail in terms of their whole career 90% of the time, especially if you're his level of like tenacity and all of that. I just think eventually you get a win under your belt. And even we talk about the early days, like he had a win before Uber. I don't know if most people realize that, but he had a decent win. Now, decent depending on how you look at it. From a venture capitalist standpoint, you'd be like, that was terrible. It wasn't a huge win. He made like $20 million. He sold his company for almost $20 million. But for him, it was huge. I mean, I think in one of the interviews I listened to, I think they said he walked away with $2 or $3 million like cash from that deal, like himself.
Which deal was that, or what company was that?
That was from Red Swoosh. And so personally walked away with a few $1 million. And so any person normally would be like, that's awesome. Like you made a few $1 million from.
And this was what, 10, 20 years ago too, right?
Yeah.
So 2 or 3 million, 10, 20 years ago was, even more than it is now, right?
Exactly. And so that was his first kind of win that he had. But even before that, I mean, he's still starting companies the whole time. So like a person like him, to like the point of like, are people like him who fail? Of course, there are people like him who would fail. But when you have that level of ambition and you can see from company to company, he just hasn't given up. He went through a decade of startups before he co-founded Uber. Like it took a while to get to that point.
What did Red Swoosh do? Remind me.
So Red Swoosh was another like peer-to-peer networking company, basically. So they had like the infrastructure for these media companies, these big publishers, essentially to have like a peer-to-peer network. I think they eventually ended up being on like 100 million different like computers, basically, to easily allow file sharing. And he was in the file sharing game with Scour, the company before as well, kind of this peer-to-peer file sharing. If anyone has seen the show on Spotify about Spotify, it was the same type of thing, using that essentially to like share music faster and have the files be like instant. And so he had a decade of experience in that. So Red Swoosh was like a file sharing type of company that he ran for about 6.5 years before he ends up exiting.
Got it. And what's funny, I did learn quite a few interesting tidbits from your newsletter. Like you would think me, I've been covering Uber and Lyft for 10 years, and I think I'm in the book Super Pumped. I don't think I made the cut for the TV show, but I think I made on page 198, 1 or 2 sentences in Mike's book. But there are a couple interesting tidbits I learned about Travis. I think you said in his newsletter that his original company, Scour, ended up getting sued by a lot of the movie or motion picture, whatever, these Hollywood types. And then for Red Swoosh, they ended up becoming his customers. Is that right?
Which is crazy. Which is
probably like, I don't know Travis, but like I imagine he was like, oh hell yeah, this feels good.
You know? Well, he's talked about in a lot of interviews. That was his revenge company. Like his revenge company was Red Swoosh. Like he literally made the 33 litigants from Scour that sued him for $250 billion.
Yeah.
He made them basically his clients, his customers for his next company. And that was intentional. And that kind of goes to show like, you don't want to compete with him or get on his bad side. And we can talk about this with Uber, but like, that's part of the reason why Uber was able to exist. I don't think someone else could have done that or will be willing to do some of the things he did, bad and good, to be clear, to make that company exist.
Yeah, no, it is interesting because I mean, I don't know how much of a part it played in him starting that next company, but I'm sure, I don't know, small, medium, large, but it sounds like it was one of the reasons he literally wanted to kind of flip the roles and make these guys that had just sued him now his customer and kind of get a little revenge that way, which I like. And the other tidbit that I read in your newsletter that was cool was that I guess he got cut out of the movie, The Social Network. It was funny. I can't remember if you quoted him or he said, he was like, I got cut out of this scene where Sean Parker is meeting with Mark Zuckerberg, their first meeting, and he was like, I got replaced by an Asian woman, which is kind of funny. Like, I don't know why they cut him out of that scene and decided to replace with an Asian woman if in real life it was him. And it kind of makes sense if he was in the whole file sharing game and he knew Sean Parker from Napster and all that. But I thought that was funny. He probably hated that, getting cut out of that scene too, I'm sure.
It's funny because researching him and all these people, like I go back to early interviews, which are like the best part of it. Because you look at interviews that are from like 2009, 2010, whatever, like very early on. And you find some of those gems like that where he talks about it. And he's like, yeah, I was out for beers with Mark afterwards. Like that was me. Like, it's just like crazy hearing those stories, like the connection of where they were at that time. And that was 2000. So Mark was 2004, maybe. So he was probably at Red Swoosh around that time. So yeah, it's interesting to hear where he was at. Like the timing of all of that stuff is like curious.
Well, and I think this is a good question about Travis, because I mean, in your research, do you find that a lot of these kind of big famous CEO types, like the best nuggets, like the most real or juicy tidbits, like come from the early days? Because I feel like once Uber's worth $1 billion and he's got a whole comms team around him, like they're probably like, don't say this, don't do that. And of course, Travis is like famous for spouting off or having issues with the media. So I kind of imagine they're like, now it is current thing, which I'm sure we'll talk about. Like no one's even heard from the guy in years, right? So what do you think about like, just from a research perspective, like you're getting the best nuggets early on?
Definitely. I think probably 2/3, if not, 3/4 of the newsletter is probably the early days. I think the best nuggets for sure are from the early days of the companies, the most fascinating, most applicable to the most people who are thinking about starting something. And so the early days is the most interesting. They have early interviews where they are not media trained at all, as you can clearly tell, but they also are real and they're going through it right there. It's like the old thing around advice, like get someone from advice, get advice from someone who's like one step ahead of you. That to me is the best part, because when they're in the interviews in the early days, they're in it right then. Like you're seeing like, what are they thinking in 2011 Uber time versus later reflecting on it? And there's a big difference between later reflecting on it and they change the story slightly and whatever versus the interviews when they are in it and they're like, this is the realness. Like this is how it turned out. Like that type of thing is interesting.
Well, and I think, yeah, it's kind of like a good lesson for founders or entrepreneurs or really anyone that it's like, if you're talking to Travis now about the early days, I mean, one, just recollecting like 10, 15 years ago is like physically hard to pull those types of memories. And then two, there's always the famous sort of like the founding story gets changed and altered and to sort of fit a better narrative. So maybe there's some make believe that happens later on just because it sounds better, right?
It's crazy because I do catch that in almost every edition, because I listen to interviews. I mean, give you context, for each edition newsletter, it's probably like at the low end, a dozen different sources of like actual interviews. Plus, then there's a lot that I can't even cite because I just find it randomly through Google. And then it ends
Some
up
guy
being
on Twitter.
Yeah, like it ends up being that to like 20 or 30 interviews, and like they're all different time frames, and there's contradictory stuff. So I always like kind of vet stuff, and you can see like they change the numbers slightly, they change the story slightly, like try to get the realness of it. You get the gist of it overall, which is still fun, but it's always fascinating though, the early days especially.
Yeah. So if there was one sort of quality or maybe one story or maybe even a company that Travis did in the early days that you think had the biggest impact on what he built with Uber, what would it be?
I mean, I would say that him going through Red Swoosh and that experience kind of set him up. So the Red Swoosh was right before Uber. So essentially what happened, he was at Red Swoosh for like 6.5 years. Then he started angel investing, took some time off, and then started co-founded Uber with Garrett Camp. And that experience for 6.5 years, like the craziness of that experience at Red Swoosh, he didn't take a salary for 4 years, was living at home for one of those years. I think he moved to like Thailand with his team for a little bit to like try to save money. Like that experience, the overall experience of that, just having to scrap, as he says, undoubtedly prepared him for Uber. So even like when he had an interview later of like got the cease and desist letter from like San Francisco for Uber cab at the time, he's like, I felt at home, like I was in the fight again, like I'm back in where I belong. So I think that stems from him fighting for the first decade, and particularly at Red Swoosh right before that, just going through that like, kind of like very rough time and like not knowing. And one thing I want to highlight from that experience, like he mentions he was living at home for a year. He mentions 4 years without a salary. But one of the interviews he did, which gave a really good point of it, is like we hear it in context of looking back at this and saying, oh, wow, 4 years without a salary, that's crazy. Like living at home for a year, that's crazy. But when you're in it, he didn't know if it was going to be 5 years. He didn't know if it was going to go to 6 years. Like he had no idea when the ending was going to come. And that's what people always forget and miss about these stories. Even if it was, even if it was 6 months, he didn't know it'd be 7 months, 8 months, 9 months. And that's the craziest part. When you hear these stories of these founders, it's like when they're in it, they had no idea if it was going to be longer, and they still persisted. How did he keep going? Why didn't he stop at 1 year or 2 years or 3 years? It's crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like it takes a special type of person to kind of have to like eat shit for that long.
Definitely.
And like, even like you said, like he ended up with $2 or $3 million walking away. So I think that is probably for 99% of people, that's a pretty good outcome and exit. But I mean, you know, also for like how hard he was working, like I wonder if he could have done something else and made that money too, like
over
gone
6
in
years,
banking
especially,
or finance or some sort of more. He's a smart guy. I think you said in your newsletter, I think he got 1580 on his SAT. So I was like, oh, I didn't realize he was also pretty smart, apparently, in addition to all these other qualities.
Yeah, he would describe himself as Rain Man analytical. He's very analytic, has the capacity in terms of math to do all the math problems, which is clear.
On a personal level, does he seem like someone you would want to be friends with and grab a beer with?
I actually, funny enough, have met him once. So in person. So when I was at USC, I was in one of the classes I was in, he was a guest speaker, and it was hilarious because this class was known for bringing in amazing, like high-level guest speakers because the professor was very connected, and he never announced who was coming in the day before. Like otherwise it would just be crazy, right? Yeah. So we get there and he's like, we have a special guest today. And like says it, and it's like Travis Kalanick. This is post Uber. So this is like in 2019 or 2020. Like it's Travis Kalanick, formerly from Uber. We're like, what? And so having that discussion though, like I asked him a question, I forget exactly what it was, but like you see the realness of the person. And obviously what most people will know is just what the media portrays, which a lot of it's warranted, some of it's overblown, and you don't have the full picture. But anytime you can like talk to someone in person and hear their responses, there's an edge of like, you can tell why how he is, but also from even the research and stuff, combine the research with what I knew from in person, he is someone who is just inherently curious. So he always wanted to jam on ideas. He had the jam pad in between Red Swoosh and Uber, which was his home where he had entrepreneurs over constantly. He's infinitely curious and likes to solve problems. So from that perspective, like that's the thing I love the most. Like I love talking about entrepreneurs, talking about problems, trying to solve. And to me, that would be the most fun part. Probably could get pretty intense with knowing him, but
it seems like, I think some of these guys, like I sort of think of like Elon Musk, like anyone who's sort of an entrepreneur at heart, like you can probably overlook almost all of anyone's faults if you see like, wow, this guy has built a $70 billion company. If you're anywhere in that sphere of working for yourself or trying to build something, you kind of know how hard it is to make $69 a month. So here's a few times a billion times that, you're like, oh my God, that's, you know what I mean? I think you can like really empathize and probably like overlook a lot of those other areas. I mean, obviously, from my perspective, having a site that's covered him for 10 years and especially in the early times, and his relationship with drivers, I think was never that great. I actually never have met him or heard him speak or even talked to him firsthand, which I always kind of joke. It like shows you what he thinks about drivers, because I had like a big site for drivers for many years, or maybe still do. But yeah, what did you sort of see in your research about his relationship with drivers?
Yeah, I mean, there's obviously a lack there. I mean, it's pretty obvious from any research you do. There's a lack of him thinking about the drivers as much as the riders. And to him, everything, if you take a step back, like everything from his life for a very long time has been about efficiency. It's what he obsesses about. He obsesses about efficiency and everything. And not only just like in a business, it's like, how do you make every aspect of it more efficient? How do you find inefficiencies and fix them? So when I mentioned like problem solving and that's what he does. So like everything he does is kind of centered around that. And for him, the focus early on was like, the rider side of it. How do we make it more efficient for them?
Yeah.
And so it was kind of neglected, thinking about, well, what about the people who supply this ride in the first place, which everyone's going to think about that side of it as well, which is very important, obviously. Like that is your workforce, is that. But he was always thinking about like the end product being the customer, the person who's actually taking the ride. And so everything was always focused on that. So I don't know if it's like an intentional thing. I just think his mind and how it works, from like the research I've done at least, is he obsesses about stuff. And so his obsession was on that piece of it. And obviously he knew the numbers from everything, but that was the majority of the focus. No neglect for sure.
So I think you mentioned a few times the word efficiency, and it really resonated with me, because I feel like one thing we always heard complaints from drivers, especially during Travis's tenure at the helm of Uber, was that Uber they really looked at drivers like a number on a spreadsheet, right? Like, hey, all of you Uber Black, and this was sort of like what the famous video of him arguing with the driver in San Francisco that Bloomberg posted from some grainy dash cam footage from a driver that made it into Super Pump. And the gist of what happened in that scene was basically Uber kind of launched in San Francisco with these black cars, and then they undercut the model by launching UberX, right? And so they had gotten a bunch of people onto Uber Black and licensed and invested in vehicles. And obviously they took some risk there. It was like they basically built the company and then kind of came in with UberX. And I'm sure Travis, or it seemed like to me like, wow, Travis is like, wow, we've got all these people now, we can serve more riders and we have more options and it's cheaper, but screwed over not only all the Uber Black drivers, but all the guys who made Uber into what it was at the start, right? And so I feel like that kind of is really what pissed off drivers so much about is, wow, not a lot of loyalty on either side, but I think that kind of concept was always something that really pissed off drivers, to be frank.
Yeah, and the thing with that too, so I remember one of the things in research is like some early drivers are making like $3,000 a week, which is amazing. Like $3,000 a week. I'm like, damn, that's impressive. But the thing is, like, inherently,
why do you think I started driving for Uber 10 years ago, Justin? I was making like 50, 60 bucks an hour. I was making more as an Uber driver doing 10, 20 hours a week than I was at my full-time job as an aerospace engineer. So didn't last forever, but yeah, there was definitely some good earning potential there at the start.
Yeah. And I definitely empathize with both sides, but from the founder side of it, it's like, I mean, I guess if you understand the industry, and most people don't understand, I guess, business or entrepreneurship and how things work, it's like everything's driven by incentives, right? I think it was either Charlie Munger or someone mentioned that, like, show me your incentives, like that's going to determine everything else. And so looking at him, like it's inevitable that Uber needs to make money and grow.
Yeah.
And the thing is, like, if they don't do that, guess what happens? Others in the market, someone will be willing to do that. In terms of UberX, obviously the whole thing with Lyft, I think UberX might have launched right before Lyft, forget which was first, but Lyft was there too. So like, if Uber didn't do it, then this company was perceived to be way better in every way, of like nicer and everything as Lyft, they would have done it. And then you're looking at them screwing drivers. And so who do you get mad at? So it's like, it's hard. Like, do you just get mad at someone because they're winning, but someone else is about to do it anyways? It's such a hard like thing. And I as I did the research to give you like an idea, it's like morally, like you're broken on each side. You're like, man, this guy kind of sucks. But like, I get why I did it, but man, it kind of sucks. And it's just like, it's very tricky, let's just say, to form an opinion.
I think that's a good point because I think originally there was a company called Sidecar, which I don't know if people remember it, where you could kind of set your own prices. And they were doing this kind of version of true ride sharing. Then Lyft came along and Uber was meanwhile doing Uber Black and saw how Lyft and Sidecar were doing. And they were like, oh, they actually, I think I don't know if it made it into the show Super Pump, but I think in Mike's book, Super Pump, he talks about how basically Travis was actually testifying against Lyft and Sidecar to the SFMTA, I believe, which was on the top floor of the Uber building. And he was like, hey, what these guys are doing is illegal. And they're like, and then once he lost that, they're like, well, maybe we should do this.
That was actually, it wasn't the show, by the way.
Okay.
It was, they put I forget the female lead, what her name was in the show, but she was the one who was
Austin.
Austin, yeah. She was acting out the scene, but she did that. But yeah, it was like, oh, you're not going to stop it. Well, we're just going to do it then. Like, what are you doing? So we mentioned Super Pump, the show and the book a couple of times. What did you think? Did you watch the TV show again as part of this research, or it sounds like you watched it in the past? What did you think of the show? I thought it was good. I mean, I am biased towards Justin Gordan, so I like him as an actor. I think that's helpful. I don't know if he was a perfect fit for the role. People think someone else should have played that, but I mean, I liked it. So I'm an entrepreneur.
I remember people commenting saying they thought the guy who played Bill Gurley in Travis,
Kyle Chandler.
Yeah, Kyle Chandler from Friday
Night Lights. Very
Lights.
much similar.
Yeah. Looks like him at least.
To TK. I mean, like I said, I've seen it multiple times, the show, because to me, like, any entrepreneurial thing, I'm just a junkie for that. Like I just get hype off of that. And so I have seen it multiple times. I think there's good and bad, but overall it's worth watching if you're like entrepreneurship, I guess. And to me, it's like pretty nostalgic, but I love the iconic, like how stories started, how these companies started. And that to me is fascinating. And that's why I write a newsletter and spend 30 hours a week on this, because I find all those stories fascinating. I never get bored of it. And so I thought the show was good. I think there's some things I'm trying to think they're not inaccurate, but just it's a show. They have to showcase.
It's kind of more entertainment, I think you would say, right? Like based off of loosely based. The arc of the story is true, but I'm sure a lot of the details, I think did a podcast or two about it, but I think a lot of the details are up for debate.
There's limitations, obviously.
Yeah. So if you could change one quality about TK, what would it be?
This is an
if you were like
question
the puppet master.
It's hard for a number of reasons, because if you change any one piece of it about TK, I don't know if Uber exists. And people can say like, oh, you could have changed the culture, could have done all this. And like, when my mind goes immediately is like, yeah, the misogynistic, sexist culture, that would be where my mind goes. But then my mind also goes, does it still exist if it wasn't? Now, it's like a terrible thing to say, but like, because he was so all consumed and like they let a lot of assholes in and all these different things of what you see in the show and people say about the culture. And obviously there's a lot of mistakes there, but if you change any of those things, does it still happen? Yeah. And I'm not sure if Uber still exists or not.
I think you're onto something. Yeah. I think the easy answer is to be like, cut out all the bad stuff. And then, the company would have been better. But I kind of agree. I think like if you cut out all the bad stuff, right, like would that drive that sort of like caused some of the bad stuff, but probably also had some redeeming qualities have worked. Like I know that a lot of the early Uber employees are very loyal to Travis. Do you think someone besides Travis could have built what Uber did? Like if Uber didn't exist, do you think Lyft could have grown the market to this point, or Sidecar, maybe it would be Lyft and Sidecar? Or do you think it sort of took someone like Travis at Uber to break down all these barriers to sort of grow the rideshare market as a whole into what it is today?
I mean, you can make the argument that like John Zimmer and Lyft did, I mean, a lot, but it was off the back of Uber. So it's hard to say if you didn't have, it's like, I mean, I watched like F1 and you see the first car going through breaks the wind. The second one, can coast behind. Like, did they coast behind Uber? Probably to some degree. So could they have started in the first place? Like my mind wants to say that, of course, someone else could have started it and could have done what they did, but also knowing how hard it was for them to break through. And we haven't even mentioned taxis, like to break through that industry. Like people don't realize how entrenched they are as an incumbent, both with the years and years of experience doing that. And then like obviously the government regulations and things that are built up for them and like money in their pockets. There's a lot of shady stuff going on. And like Travis talks about that in interviews. Like, how do you think anyone would have won this without being a little bit disruptive inherently? Like, I don't know if it would exist.
I think a lot disruptive, huh?
Yeah, and the default does not change. The default is status quo. right?
Well,
So
and I
like,
mean,
how do
there are
you
some interesting, kind of examples. Like in Vegas, there were literally like cops or mob people with like AK-47 or like machine, or what do you call them, semi-automatic rifles with these Uber drivers. There was all these like crazy situations. I think there's been stories now that like the NYC taxi medallions were literally linked to the mob. So I mean, there's some pretty serious stuff going on with some of like these entrenched taxis. And I think it sounds like, I'm going to say this. I think we agree that like if it took someone like Travis and a company like Uber to grow the market to what it is, to like be able to call an Uber and get an Uber in sort of the same fashion. I think without Uber, I think the rideshare market would have still existed, but I don't know if it would have been anywhere as ubiquitous and sort of as good of a product as it is today.
Well, it's one of those things where the idea is good enough where you'd like to think it would have happened eventually,
Yeah,
right?
maybe that.
But then you think about like, I'll put you on the spot. Who's like a nice CEO, you think? Like a nice person CEO? Give me an example.
I don't know. Maybe whoever runs Trader Joe's. Whenever I go in there, all the employees are very happy. So I feel like they must be pretty nice.
So like the person who founded Trader Joe's, do you think they started
Yeah.
Uber? Like in terms of that, like I'm researching right now Brian Chesky from Airbnb,
Uh-huh.
and he's a phenomenal CEO, and they built a phenomenal business. But do I think he has like I don't know if it's the asshole in him to actually do what Uber did? I don't know, because they had to deal with a lot of regulations as well, right?
Yeah.
And they took a different approach. Early on, they were kind of picketing per se, going against them, but it didn't last long. They very quickly, Airbnb was like, oh, we need to be friends with these cities. This is the way to go about it. This is our culture, everything. Could they have fought? Could Uber have done that and won? I don't know.
I mean, you're right. They're on the regulatory. It's sort of funny. You kind of forget about these regulatory battles. I think they documented in Super Pumped in New York City, where they literally kind of mobilized their workforce. They launched this de Blasio option in the app that would show what life would be like if the city got its way. So, I mean, they did some sort of pretty creative and aggressive and maybe sometimes over the line stuff. So I feel like these days I see, especially in the startup space or just in general, I always see people saying not necessarily like Uber for X, but like we're like using Uber as like, hey, you should go angel invest because like the first few investors at Uber turned 25,000 into 50 million. And I feel like Uber was like a once in a lifetime thing. But do you think in kind of like the startup and tech ecosystem that they were like, how do you sort of, where do you rank Uber in like that startup ecosystem? How do you think about it in terms of either other startups or other opportunities or anything like that?
There are a few, they're definitely like a once in generation type of company, but I think you can make the argument for, as an investor, a few others that maybe were in that same boat or are in that same boat. One being Stripe. So I wrote about Patrick Collison, and Stripe for the longest time, I mean, they were valued at like 95 billion. It got decreased a bit with the hit in the market, but also look at Airbnb and how much they grew over time as well. Look at some of those companies. It's funny.
Yeah, Airbnb is a good one.
Yeah, I have a friend who worked at Uber, and he didn't get the role at Airbnb and got Uber. And it's like funny, the stock, like which stock goes up more than the other as an engineer looking at that.
Yeah.
And I think there's a few companies like that you could have invested in early. And you can make the example of other ones as well, but it is such a rarity. I'm very bullish on people angel investing and getting a feel for companies if they have the capital to do so. But I think that the realization is you have to have expectations around, you're trying to land one of those in theory, but also a lot of companies are not going to be that, like for the most part. Not saying you can't still make money in that way, in that capacity. Like I've done probably 10 small angel investments so far. I don't think any are going to be Uber size, but do I think ones that have potential to be solid companies? Definitely. And so like there's that side of it if you're an angel investor where it's a little bit different. You like the chance of having someone like an Uber because you don't know often so early. Like it's just on my mind because I'm writing about Airbnb right now. I'm in the research currently, and like it was more than a year. And they ran out of money. So if you would have invested in them, and they got introduced to 20 investors, and all of them said no early on within a year and a half. So like hard to make the argument for them, any company.
Yeah, I guess I feel very lucky that I just happened to start driving for Uber and Lyft and covering the company and kind of riding there. Maybe like you said with Lyft, I'm just riding the coattails and seeing how things go. So kind of wrapping up, what do you think Travis's reputation is now, or sort of now that it's been a few years since he's been at the helm and Uber it's like in the mainstream now, right? Obviously.
Yeah, it's funny because I've posted about him on Twitter. So when I launched the newsletter, I always post about it on Twitter. And even when I wrote the edition, I first like struggled to write it. I'm like, should I write about him or not? It was like the first debate. Like, do I write about this guy who obviously cause a lot of people harm, but also create a world-changing company. That was like the first one. Do I have to write about him at all? And then once I did, it was like, how do I promote it? How do I write it where I capture the fact that there's a sentiment that's very negative against him? Yeah. There's the alternate, which is, again, world-changing company. And you can't like make these people gods. They are real people. So you have to like balance that. So I think today, which was interesting when I published that tweet about him, the amount of likes and like positive sentiment it got. Because in my head, I do think that actually, I think that most people just respect the hell out of him as an entrepreneur. Yeah. And they are willing to either glance over some of his thoughts or, as I wrote about in the article, like he's paid for his sins. He lost the love of his life, which was Uber. He got kicked out. Like, and his mom died that same year. Like there was a lot of like shit he went through that it's like, humanize it a little bit and be like, he is a person. And so I don't look at him as like a monster, a god, either one. I'm like, he's a person who like very determined, create a world-changing company, a lot of things like that. Yeah. But I think people respect him tremendously. And the sentiment seems to be that.
So you are right. I mean, it wasn't a super happy ending for him with Uber, right? I mean, he cashed out, I guess you would say, right? Because he, was the founder and made a lot of money off of it. But I mean, he lost the company, right? I mean, he basically got kicked out as CEO. His mother passed away, which just was kind of like really unfortunate, I guess, timing or right around that time. But yeah, it wasn't like a great outro, I guess you would say, for him, right?
And less than 10 years, right? Like, I mean, I just wrote about Tory Burch from her company. She started in 2004. Well, she launched in 2004. She really started in 2003, 2002. So you're looking at like, okay, 20 years of her running her company. And she's still as excited today about it as she was 20 years ago. Travis Kalanick got what, 8 years to run his company? Yeah. Like as an entrepreneur, your baby, you want
Although
to
I feel like 8 years in Uber time is probably like 20 years at some other companies, because I feel like almost everyone I knew that was working at Uber in the early days took like a year-long sabbatical after they were done at Uber. But yeah, I get your point.
Yeah, taking that away is hard, very hard to say the least.
Very cool. Well, I think that was a pretty interesting deep dive. And you know what? I will say there was a lot that we didn't even talk about that is in your newsletter. So for folks listening that kind of want to go down memory lane, maybe learn a little bit more about Travis, or even find the Twitter handle for that jam pad, because you did link to it and it is still active. So you're going to have to read the newsletter if you want to find that. We'll leave a link in the show notes where they can go and check that out. It's justgogrind.com. And before we let you go, if there's anything else you want to say or how folks can get a hold of you or follow you, let us know. But I also want to give you the chance to ask me a question, either about Uber or Travis. So Justin, the spotlight is now yours for a second.
I am most curious about, you've been covering them for so long, these rideshare companies, right? What has it been like to see the evolution as you've kind of been in it and the growth of Uber and coinciding that like with your business? I'm curious on how that has their trajectory with your trajectory. Like how has that gone for you?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think in the early days, I first started driving for Uber and Lyft in 2014. And it was basically the same week or two I started my blog. Hey, here's what it's like to be a driver. It was very quickly a quick follow up after. And so it was kind of at that point, like before people were talking about it, your grandparents or your parents didn't quite know about it yet. So it was really in that like super hot companies raising billions of dollars every few months, kind of like fun times. Drivers were making a lot and there was a lot going on, a lot of interest. And so I was sort of just riding the coattails. I thought it would be a cool opportunity to drive, maybe make a little website about it. And then the company exploded. So from that perspective, I feel like really fortunate that I was just there for those first few years where everything was exploding. And I was even able to monetize the site by referring new Uber drivers and then kind of build a business around that. And I've been running my business, the Rideshare Guy, full time now for 8 or 9 years. And it's allowed me to leverage into a lot of different opportunities, conferences, consulting, advising, investing, new podcasts, just like all these different things. And it's all basically because I started driving for Uber and writing about it. So in that way, I'm like fortunate about it. And I think that like, to me, one interesting thing is that I've sort of seen like every 3-4 years, it's like kind of a new group. In the first 3, 4, 5 years, it was like that TK group. And then it was like the Dara group. And it's like, I'm outlasting almost everyone at these companies, right? So it's that part for me is sort of funny. And now it's like the past few years, delivery is exploding. Like now half of our traffic and revenue is more food delivery and last mile delivery. So there's always like something going on and something next. So for me, it's kind of just like something breaks and I sort of start following the trends. I feel like that's kind of what I've been up to.
It's funny just to follow up real quick on that, because you mentioned 2014. That was like the beginning of some of the negative things from Travis. And then you see their growth is still taking off insanely. And then you've been through all of that plus an IPO plus a CEO change, like the whole time, there's a lot of content and
Well,
things to
and
talk
it's
about.
also funny too, because I've never worked at Uber or any of the companies, obviously, but like I have a lot of really good friends who worked in those first 4 or 5 years. Like they may not have loved me in the first 4 or 5 years, but they knew of me or we kind of were in the same circles. And then it's like, all right, now they're long gone and we can kind of, they sort of are still much more interested. Or one of my best friends here in LA, he was like an early Uber employee. So it's sort of funny that like my relationship with people at the companies obviously changes depending on kind of the time frame and also like what they're working on. But at the same time, like I've never actually worked at the company. So I'm like this outside observer who kind of knows a lot about certain things, but like I've never even met Travis Kalanick. Like I've been covering the company for 10 years. I've interviewed Dara 3 or 4 times. So it's like certain people I know well, others I don't. I can kind of like talk shit about certain people, but maybe I'm wrong, maybe I'm right. But have lots of different anecdotes and sources. So yeah, I like my position though, because I think it's a lot easier than like when I was reading through what Travis did in your newsletter, I'm like, oh God, this sounds like my nightmare. I'd rather just go out and do some rides and blog about what it's like to not have someone puke in the back of your car. That sounds more fun to me.
His is a bit different, let's just say. Let's just say a lot of different cities, a lot of different moving parts with that. And yeah, crazy company to run.
Very cool. Well, so if folks want to learn more about what you're up to at Just Go Grind and follow or subscribe to your newsletter, where can they go? Where should they follow you?
Very simple, justgogrind.com, justgogrind.com. Easiest place to find me, and everything's from there.
All right, perfect. Well, we'll leave a link in the show notes. And thank you very much for doing this profile on TK. We look forward to your Dara profile in maybe a year or two, and we'll have to have you back on.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Harry.
All right, see you.